What's a story from history that made you go, what the F? Agnes MacDonald, wife of the first Canadian Prime Minister, traveled with her husband out west after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. She was really excited to see the country, but to her dismay she couldn't see much from inside the train because the steam from the engine blocked the view. Her solution: they tied a chair to the cowcatcher on the front of the train and then tied her to the chair. She rode to British Columbia tied to the front of the train like a ship's figurehead. Good job the cowcatcher wasn't needed to, catch any cows on that journey. No cows, but the train did smack into a bunch of pigs. She thought it was great fun, but her husband's secretary, who was forced to sit up there with her to supervise her, got hit by a flying pig and wasn't so impressed with the adventure. No cows, but the train did smack into a bunch of pigs. She thought it was great fun, but her husband's secretary, who was forced to sit up there with her to supervise her, got hit by a flying pig and wasn't so impressed with the adventure. How did this part of the story get left out in your original comment? Because like most of the history, once you start digging there is no end. History tend to remember things that were first or what you would call crazy at that time. And it branches out like your neurons making connections trying to remember all this crap that deep down you won't ever use in your life. Like a stoned medical student researching her homework on Wiki. 2 hours later waking up from reading about early legal system in Inca Empire. Wondering how did you get here from researching common flu transmission vectors? Got hit by a flying pig and wasn't so impressed. Because that secretary just lost every argument in which they use the phrase when pigs fly. Who needs a cowcatcher when you've got these guns? Agnes MacDonald, probably. Did she survive? Yes. She even went on to write a book about it, By Car and by Cowcatcher. This all just sounds so goddamned made up, but I looked it up and sure enough you are 100% right. Wow. As a Canadian, this is the most badass Canadian thing anyone can do. Smiley face, smiley face, smiley face. In ancient Egypt, servants were smeared with honey to attract flies away from the pharaoh. Makes me wonder, why not just smear it on an inanimate objects like a stick? Less fun? Some bugs sense the presence of things by the heat of things, or the expulsion of C0 squared. So a stick might catch a few, but a breathing warm thing? Much better. There was a samurai who was actually worried about how obsolete their system had become, and now that samurais were no longer needed in Japan. He decided to go to Korea and insult them so much that they would kill him, and thus the rest samurais would avenge him by going to war with Korea and proving their worth. That sounds like a seriously cool movie plot. Some director actually has to make this. He was called The Last Great Samurai. We already have the title of the movie. Well, that's not nice. Why does Korea often has to suffer when Japan gets bored? Well, from what I've read historically, Wikipedia, it seems like the main reasons: the Japanese have very little arable land. Mostly mountainous, so they're in need of food crops. The Japanese have very little and natural resources, so they have to venture out whenever a warlord unified the factions or made peace with one another. It would be a short-lived peace. One of them had a grand idea to invade China because fight the foreigners abroad instead of each other home. But that quickly changed to Korea because of how terribly corrupt and unorganized government was. Japan never was truly successful in conquering other countries until 1800s, but yeah, honestly sucks. Whenever Japan invades a place they try force assimilation and culture destruction. Japan never was truly successful in conquering other countries until 1800s. Well, centuries of self-imposed isolation will do that. Wouldn't have been the first time. Japan has been really crafty to Korea. People in the Middle Ages sentenced insects to exile after destroying crops. This isn't just a Middle Ages thing. Mao Zedong did something along the lines of this too, except he tried to get all the sparrows killed as well. Only problem with that is that sparrows eat the plant-eating insects, so the insects started mass reproducing and caused a famine. Congratulations, you played yourself the sparrows. Didn't he at the same time demand metal be collected to make weapons? Political zealots gathered all they could, including farming equipment and cooking utensils. thus making the famine worse and killing an estimated 50 million people? He took farmers out of the fields and forced them into factories. He also required people to have a smelter to make steel, but all the steel was poor quality and couldn't be used. I have a feeling he didn't become ruler because of his intelligence. He became ruler because of his wartime success during World War II. Being good in war does not mean you're good in governing. George Washington is one of a very, very small group of generals who were good in war and in governing. He's also probably the only founding father of a country that didn't become king and also stepped down by his own volition. Get out of here, you effing locust. Man tries to exile insect, more at 7. Xerxes I. He ordered to build a bridge across the Hellespont, and when it was nearly completed, a storm had destroyed the bridge. He got so pissed off that he ordered the soldiers to whip the sea 300 times for not complying with his plans. Edit. Apparently he also ordered for all the engineers who built the bridge to be beheaded before whipping the sea. Honestly, that's relatable. How else are you supposed to react? Yeah, I get really pissed off at nature pretty frequently. I just lack the influence to force others to punish it. This sounds like some Greek propaganda. You won the war, move on. The first time I heard that, I just had to Google it to see if it was real, because I didn't believe that some guy over 2,000 years ago ordered to whip the sea 300 times. I mean, Caligula went to war with Poseidon in the sea. Fake ancient news. At least I have read a lot of opinions that it was smear propaganda by his political rivals. What I read is, he sent soldiers to somewhere, but they refused to board ships as sea was too wavy. Those were elite soldiers, so he couldn't execute them without causing dissent in army. He couldn't let them go unpunished, as that would show him weak. So he decided to humiliate them a bit, declared war on Poseidon, made experienced good soldiers hit water and collect seashells. And then threw a parade for them as for victorious soldiers. With the loot they brought a bunch of seashells. Which was more of a public shaming. This is the most sensible interpretation I've ever heard about the whole incident. The Boston Molasses flood. Molasses should not be able to move at 35 miles per hour. Web link. They say you can still smell the molasses nowadays during hot summer days. I'm going to Boston to smell the molasses, if you know what I mean. Smell the molasses. Honestly, Boston's been through so much crap that no random smell surprises me. The Boston Malasaker. That means you're slower than molasses. Nerd. Apparently in ancient Egypt the pharaoh would rub one out into the Nile in a ritual to make sure the fields would be fertile. There was actually a whole lot of overt male sexuality in ancient Egyptian religion. Their creation myth is legitimately that the first god, Adam, rose out of the waters, rubbed one out, and the next generation of gods sprang from that first ejaculation. No jokes. Pretty much all their statues featured giant boners up until the early Christians went about knocking them off. The earliest Egyptologists were Victorian era and were much too embarrassed about it all to publicize it, so it's been largely brushed under the rug. Edit. Spelling. Would love to have some sources if you don't mind. Am Egyptian, can confirm in general, although it's been a while since I've studied the details. There is / was a god of fertility, and there still are hieroglyphic depictions of him with an erect penis. Was it just the pharaoh? I remember reading about it being a giant ass event where everyone gathered by the Nile and followed. Why can't we have that now? I mean, being cool with masturbation. Because we're all in denial. I'll see myself out. Be gone. Because then we would have penile problems. Just go into any lazy river at any water park on any summer day. Your wheat fields will flourish. The military government of Myanmar built an entirely new capital in the middle of the jungle from scratch simply because their astrologer told them to. I remember seeing a little bit about this on the Top Gear special when they went to Myanmar, or Burma if you prefer. A colossal, 20-lane highway leading into a city that had nowhere near enough people to fully populate it. He also talked about how the crackpot dictator, who was the one listening to these astrologers, felt that his country was becoming too left-wing. So he says everyone now has to drive on the right-hand side of the road. In right-hand drive cars. Emperor Nero married a boy named Sporus whom he had castrated and present as a woman in public. It wasn't the first man Nero had married, but it's the first he'd made present as a woman. Nero had Sporus appear in public as his wife wearing the regalia that was customary for Roman empresses. Among other forms of address, Sporus was termed lady, empress, and mistress. Apparently Sporus bore a strong resemblance to Nero's wife Poppaea, who had died in childbirth, or he'd kicked her to death while pregnant. It's not proven either way, and he even called Sporus by that name. Poor old Sporus had a pretty crap life after Nero's death and married another man, a Praetorian prefect who'd been a part of getting Nero killed. This man treated Sporus as a wife also and was killed when he thought he'd also try his hand at being emperor. Finally Sporus ended up with Otho, who was yet another emperor. Otho had been married to poor Poppaea before Nero forced their divorce, and Otho himself died violently after the Battle of Bedriacum. The victor of the battle, Vitellius, declared he intended to use Sporus as a victim in a public reenactment of the rape of Proserpina during a gladiator show. Sporus, no doubt sick of everyone's crap, committed suicide rather than face the public humiliation. My username is finally relevant, but it doesn't make me look good. Tell me about it. This dude was basically getting effed over and over his entire life. And instead of getting raped to death in the Colosseum, he killed himself. Honestly, makes perfect sense. He was only 20 when he died. He lived 1,000 awful lifetimes before most of us even start living. I was even more shocked when I realized this all happened in 2 to 3 years. Absolutely insane. It's crazy to think this all came from the civilization that called the Brythonic Celts barbaric. I sort of get it. At face value, the Celts were light years behind the Romans when you think of the sum of their parts and not just the one bloke running the show. The Romans were very good at throwing up just enough incredibly smart, capable people who could manifest great feats of engineering and warfare to prop up the maniacs/s running it for so long. I can see how they looked at what they had as being incredibly superior to the Celts at the time, bearing in mind they also didn't care to get to know the complexity of the people they were conquering. The Romans were also incredibly nationalistic. Being in the business of war, it made sense to think of everyone else as uncultured swine, made killing them all far easier. They also didn't care to get to know the complexity of the people they were conquering. Did anyone ever? The Byzantine Empire, the true successors to the legacy of Rome, don't at me, had a kind of Department of Foreign Affairs, State Department that kept tabs on the cultures and political conditions of surrounding factions. They were in charge of foreign relations, and managed the reception of diplomatic missions into the empire. The Byzantines were masters of diplomacy and political intrigue, and maintained their position as much through playing other powers against each other as they did through open warfare, web link. Oh boy, that dude really got dealt a crappy hand relationship-wise. Terrer eating a effin' baby. Pretty much everything about Terrer is deeply disturbing. I find everything about him so creepy, including his physical description. He was like a human tapeworm. Yep. Dude was super skinny and had chipmunk cheeks and literally ate dead bodies when he was hospitalized. Like WTF, man. Apparently the records of his life after he left the hospital for eating a baby are unknown, so who knows what he did between that and his death. Terrer, look at me. Did you eat a effing baby? Unintelligible noises from his abdomen. In all honesty, if he really did eat a effing baby, it really apps with me on how much pain it probably was in. It also sounds horrific, and I wouldn't want to see that happening right in front of my eyes. I want my baby back. 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 Chili's baby back ribs. That Wikipedia search was a goddamn ride, laughing my butt off. Terrer, circa 1772 to 1798, was a French showman and soldier, noted for his unusual appetite and eating habits. He ate so much that his parents couldn't provide for him and turned him away. During his life he traveled with a band of thieves, was opening act for a charlatan, worked as a street performer, served as a courier in the French army, underwent various procedures to try to cure him of his appetite, was suspected of eating a toddler, so was ejected from the hospital, and died 4 years later of tuberculosis. Web link. That's just crazy. He's only going to be hungry again in half an hour. At the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis, the marathon was a total mess. The first-place finisher did most of the race in a car, the guy in second almost died from eating rat poison, and the fourth-place finisher raced in dress pants and shoes, and took a nap by the side of the road for part of the race. The most WTF history fact I know. Messy as well as comic. The Olympics there coincided with their World's Fair, which had some new things debut that are still with us, like the first ice cream waffle cone, and also had a zoo full of exotic humans from afar and the famous Native American leader Geronimo. The Cadaver Synod. In 897, Pope Stephen VI exhumed the corpse of one of his predecessors, Pope Formosus, and put it on trial. He had a deacon stand behind the cadaver and move its mouth and talk for it while Stephen charged Formosus with becoming pope illegally. When Formosus was declared guilty, the papal vestments were stripped off his rotting body, his blessing fingers were cut off, and he was buried in a graveyard for foreigners. He was then dug up again and his body was thrown into the Tiber River. His body was retrieved from the river and a later pope nullified the Cadaver Synod, and he is now buried in St. Peter's Basilica in his papal vestments. The cardinals who helped with the Cadaver Synod were excommunicated and they made a law that cadavers could not be put on trial. Then a later pope upheld Formosus' guilt and put a plaque on Stephen's tomb praising him for his Cadaver Synod. Edit. Changed successors to predecessors. Sorry about that. I also revisited this story on Wikipedia and found out that after being thrown into the Tiber, Formosus' body washed up on shore and started performing miracles. Local people rose up and imprisoned Stephen, and later strangled him to death for what he did to Formosus. Just makes an already fabulous story even wackier. I wonder how wrecked the body looked by the end. It would be cool to open the tomb and have a look. So you thought you could get away from the law with that little dying stunt of yours? You've mixed up the word successor and predecessor. Sound like he dug up a predecessor, not successor. Is he ripe yet? No? Back in you go. Thank you for watching. If you like our videos, please like them on YouTube. And share them with your friends. Please subscribe to be the first to know about Red Rabbit Reader's new videos. We welcome your comments below. Another of our videos will begin shortly.